And as a master student completing his thesis, you don't want to know what my diet looks like for an example of how people should be eating. I was drinking like 4 double shot espresso, like Starbucks mocha things a day. And then I was like, oh shit, it's 10 p.m. and I have to hit my protein. So let's chug 3 Fairlife protein bottles with 44 grams of protein each.
Oh, God.
Don't live like that. Don't eat like that. This is not a recommendation. But I mean, look, you kind of got it. You kind of hit the nail on the head there, which is like, there's pretty loose rules here as far as nutrition is concerned, which is really, that's really nice for a lot of people, is that like there are some, fundamental things that you should do.
What is up, everybody? My name is Kyle Matovcik. I am the host of the In Liberty and Health podcast, where we talk all things liberty, health, and wellness, and beyond. My hope is to encourage and spread the message of liberty and physical and mental well-being. I hope you enjoy all the topics we talk about with our guests. We're on all major streaming platforms, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Man, I'm doing as good as anyone can do getting buried by his 13-year-old son on leg day.
I'm not going to apologize for not being on this podcast because I got to go see Metallica. So if that's a problem, kiss my ass.
Okay?
All right.
All right, everybody, this is In Liberty and Health, and today I've been looking forward to this conversation. I have Max Coleman with me. He works underneath the world's leading hypertrophy researcher, Brad Schoenfeld, but I'll let him introduce himself much better than I can. So, Max, go ahead. How you doing?
I'm really good, man. Thank you so much for having me. So like you said, my name is Max. I'm just now finishing up my master's program under Dr. Schoenfeld. In fact, I'll defend my thesis and hopefully before the month is over. So I'll actually be an NMS in exercise science. And I'm mostly interested in, just like Brad Schoenfeld, manipulating training variables in hopes to elicit as much of a hypertrophic response as we can. So simply put, I'm interested in training to get jacked.
Yeah, I think that's just about every single dude who ever picked up a weight in his entire life. That's generally their goal. Kind of where did all this start for you? I want to get there, and then we can get to kind of like your research stuff later. I'm guessing, well, like how old are you, and like what age did you start resistance training?
Yeah, so there's a conversation about how I got into lifting, and then there's obviously a conversation about what got me into like the evidence-based research side of lifting. So I'm 25. Yes, I'm 25. Just making sure. I just turned 25 in April, so that's why I had to make sure. But I'm 25, and yeah, and it's only downhill from here too, right? That quarter life crisis everyone's always talking about. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm 25, and I started lifting when I was about 11 or 12. And I just got into lifting for the same reason every Gen Z kid around my age got into lifting. I joked about this on another podcast, but basically like just Marvel movies and Wolverine basically being jacked and me being like, oh, I'd like to be jacked too. So how can I do that? And then looking into that. And then, so that was around 12 years old. And then I basically just lifted like a bro from 12 to 18, 19. And then I started getting involved a little bit more with some evidence-based stuff. I was introduced to people like Brad Schoenfeld, Mike Israetel, Eric Helms, and stuff. Mm-hmm. And that started kind of gearing my way of thinking about lifting and stuff towards an evidence-based approach. And then that was just a rabbit hole from there that got me to where I am today, which is hopefully graduating with a master's in human performance here soon.
Yeah, dude, that's awesome. You're about 3 years younger than me, but you got a evidence-based approach down much, much sooner than I did. Because I started training probably around the same age, and I really didn't start diving into the research and learning how to like actually train and learning that, oh, you could train a body part more than once a week until I was probably around like 24, 25. So about as old as you are now. And like, it is just absolutely phenomenal. I'm sure you had this experience too, that whenever you figured out like training, that there's more than just the bro split, that like your gains are just, off the table. You're like, holy shit, I left all this on the table for years. It's incredible. Did you kind of have a similar experience?
I'm really sorry, Kyle. I don't know what happened, but I can't hear you anymore. I think something cut off or something.
Oh, my bad. Can you hear me?
Oh, you're back now. That was weird. Okay. Sorry. I lost you after talking about gains soaring after learning about the evidence-based side.
Yeah, so when you kind of found out about the evidence-based kind of stuff when you were 18-ish, did your gains kind of take off? Because that's definitely the way it was for me. Because like I said, I had like almost 10 years under my belt. And then finally, once I learned how to actually train right and you could do more than just a bro split, I was like, holy crap. Like I left all this on the table for years.
Yeah, so I wish I could be like, yeah, I found out who Dr. Israel was, and all of a sudden I put 3 inches on my biceps. But unfortunately, that's not really the case. The truth is, I wasn't training like a complete idiot from 12 years old to 18 or 19. I was training generally pointed in the right direction. So my goal has always been hypertrophy and just getting jacked. So I was still training hard. I was still training with relatively high volumes. Maybe doing some things a little bit less intelligently, not really managing fatigue as well as I should have been. And then the nutrition side of thing obviously hindered my progress as well. But it wasn't anything like exponential. It was just I learned these new tricks, but I learned the principles of training for hypertrophy and eating for muscle growth. And it started just trickling along and add, pound of muscle here, a couple ounces of muscle. And it was a gradual increase rather than me being like, oh my God, how have I been leaving these gains on the table? I wish that it was like switching to an evidence-based approach was like the equivalent of taking D-ball for the first time, but that just wasn't how it was for me, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, like I said, for me, it was just I wasn't going nearly hard as I should have, and it was also kind of like the nutrition stuff for me because I was at one point a lot more heavy set, and then I lost about 70 pounds. Was I kind of got my nutrition in check, and like I just remember for years I was like, oh, who would have thought eating correctly would bring you much better gains and better body composition? Like it doesn't make any sense at all, right? So one thing that you wrote about and that I've kind of gone back and forth with is training to failure. So if you listen to a lot of the guys on YouTube and TikTok, they'll tell you have to go to failure because you're going to impose the highest stimulus possible. But from what I understand from most of the research, and I listen to a lot of the same people that you do, Lane Norton, Eric Helms, Mike Israel, Brad Schoenfeld, those kind of guys. It seems like most evidence suggests that if you're within like 1, 2, maybe even 3 reps shy of failure, you get just about the same benefits as training to failure. And I know that one of the papers you sent over to me was kind of highlighting some of this. So I'm curious your kind of thoughts and your experience with training to failure and if you still incorporate it or not.
Yeah. So this is an interesting conversation and one that I'll try not to just repeat all the same things that we often hear. I was just talking to a friend about this, because I personally think that like proximity to failure is one of the most important variables when it comes to making adaptations across almost all fitness characteristics in the gym, but definitely hypertrophy and definitely strength, which is what the majority of people are talking about anyways. And I was saying that I think that a lot of the bros in the world, the bro Arnold split guys in the world would stand to benefit a lot from listening to nerds like me and people in the evidence-based side. And I also think that a lot of nerds like me and a lot of people in the evidence-based side would stand to benefit a lot from listening to the bros, right? So do I think training to failure is necessary for eliciting the best goals, whether it be strength or hypertrophy? Of course not. Anyone who is up to date with what's going on in the world is aware that training to failure is absolutely not necessary if you want to get jacked or strong. However, most people who are also up to date with the literature know that most people aren't training to failure, even when they say they are, right? It turns out that even training status doesn't seem to be a really good indicator of if someone's good at predicting their proximity to failure, right? So do I think training to failure is a good idea, even though it's not necessary? Absolutely. I think that it's necessary to train to failure solely so that you can know what it feels like to fail. And then using that, what we call setting the anchor, will allow you to know what it feels like to be 1, 2, 3 reps away from failure, right? And I think that can be extremely valuable. And then also, I don't think that going to failure is nearly as scary or detrimental as a lot of people say. I know Greg Knuckles talks about this a lot. Like he says he's never done a set of bicep curls not to failure. And I don't know who that's hurting. Obviously, there's certain exercises obviously that are more conducive to it, like lateral raises. Who's hurting themselves or their progress doing lateral raises to failure, right? And then there are obviously instances where you would probably want to avoid that, like benching alone or doing like a deadlifts to failure or squats to failure, right? So sorry, I'm rambling here at this point, but I think that training to failure is really good for setting that anchor and letting you know what it feels like to be close to failure. But aside from that, I don't see a whole lot of benefit from it in general. Okay. And then on the same hand, I'm obviously apprehensive about telling people not to train to failure for the same reasons I was just saying, which is that most people, I would say on average, are a little bit further away from failure maybe than they should be. So then telling people, oh, you don't need to go to failure, it's not a big deal, may further exacerbate that issue, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to me, it kind of seems like when the bar starts to slow down, or whatever exercise you're doing really starts to slow down on the on the extension, that's probably a sign that you're getting pretty close. And it seems like there's also a lot of debate in what people may define as failure. So like some people may say when you can't complete another clean rep, that's failure, or when you can't physically move the weight anymore, that's failure. What is the most common definition amongst the literature, and what would be the definition that you would use?
Okay. To say, I can't give you what's the most. There's a huge conversation right now just amongst people in this field is like, what is failure? And I think James Steele has an amazing paper on what is failure. So I don't think that there is a most commonly used term for failure, definition for what we usually refer to as failure. So we most commonly, I would say that there's two that are like show up the most frequently, and those are volitional failure, which is just, I think, a bit of a misnomer. I think volitional cessation would be a much better term, because volitional failure is just a way we kind of like hedge our bets and like cover our asses in the research world, where we're saying that these people they say they're failing, like the subjects or whoever it is training, right, says they're failing, and it's volitional cessation of the movement. So to call that failure, I think, is a bit of a misnomer, like I said. And then the other most common, which I think is a little bit easier to wrap your head around and easier to quantify, is just concentric muscle failure, which is, like you were just saying, you cannot move the weight in concentrically at all. So like on a bench press, you can go down, but there is no going up no matter how much force you try putting into that bar, right? And I think that is typically, when I say failure, that's usually what I mean. I mean concentric failure, where even if you are giving it your all, you are not able to complete that rep with proper form on whatever exercise it is that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that generally seems to be what I would define as failure, what most people seem to pin as failure as well. So when it comes to programming, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but the way that I typically program failure, and I'm guessing you probably do something similar if you're going to do it, obviously no compound lifts. So like you said, no squats, deadlifts, bench press alone. But when it comes to, let's say, like a bicep curl, tricep extension, lateral raises, or some, leg extension, hamstring curls, you could probably safely go to failure. And the way that I personally would program it would be at the very end of like your exercise for that specific body part, take that very, very last set to failure, and then, you're good. Would you disagree with that, or would that be kind of how you program that as well?
It's definitely not how I personally program for my clients or myself, but I don't disagree with it. So I think it's, as you know, you're a coach, so it's like a very much an individual basis. You have kind of go case by case, because I'm sure you've had some clients where going to failure can wreck them for their next workout, even if it's the last workout of the week for that muscle group. Some people going to failure just leads them to like accrue so much fatigue that even if you give them a couple of days, they're still a little bit more beat up than they probably should be before their next workout. And like you said, it kind of depends on the person and also the muscle we're talking about. You take your lateral delts to failure, they're good tomorrow. How often are your delts sore from training? It's just not something that happens even if you smash your delts. It's just not something that happens. Whereas if I were to do, like, even you said hamstring curls, and this is obviously what I said, case by case. Myself, if I do hamstring curls to failure, I'm fucked for like 4 days. Like I can't walk, let alone like train my hamstrings again if I train them with like all out balls to the wall failure, right? So it's better for people like me and other any listeners that like find that to be the case for them to maybe stay away from failure. Now, that's not to say that I'm training easily. Like a set that's 2 RIR, that's 2 reps away from failing, is not an easy set. It's very difficult, but it's difficult enough to where it stimulates the muscle, but not so difficult to where it inhibits my next training session.
I am stoked to tell you guys about the show's new sponsor. I am now working with MTS Nutrition, which is a brand that I've believed in for a very long time, and they run awesome cells and they have awesome products. So I want to tell you about their amazing protein powder, which you're going to ask me how many pounds I have of the protein powder, and the answer is all of them. So here I got Red Velvet Cake, 25 grams of protein, and they have the amino acids and everything on there, 59 servings. Peanut butter fluff, Fluffernutter, 26 grams of protein. And then also the chocolate chip cookie, which literally has real pieces of chocolate chip cookie in there. So 27 grams of protein, 180. As I've talked about on the show, getting your protein in is very, very important. So make sure you hit that link below and purchase your protein powder through MTS Nutrition. Boom!
Like I said, that's a case-to-case basis. So I'm not saying that you programming that way for your clients or yourself is necessarily wrong by any means.
Yeah. And right now, we were talking a little bit off air. I just finished my deload. And for usually the first couple weeks, I won't train to failure. I'll get pretty close, but then usually towards the end, I'll start to program in the training to failure. But usually how I know it's time to deload is like, it's the last week or two, and I'm like, man, I don't want to train. I'm miserable. I'm tired. So it's probably a good idea. Hey, bump back up to maintenance for a little bit, and let's just, kind of hang loose, eat, enjoy. Don't worry about anything. Just get a good stimulus in and, get out. Don't worry about beating yourself up too much. Yeah. So when it comes to kind of doing deloads, then what's your kind of thoughts and programming around that?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, I just finished the thesis that I've been like kind of alluding to this whole conversation is a study on deloads. So it was a study where we took 50 subjects. We started with 50 and we lost some, it's just the nature of longitudinal studies. So we ended up with, I believe, 38 or 39 subjects. And you were either in a group where you trained for 9 weeks straight and then that was it. You just trained for 9 weeks straight, or you trained for 4 weeks. You took 1 week completely off of training, and then you trained for 4 more weeks, right? Kind of a proof of concept to see how we felt about or to see what effects a deload might cause, right? And I definitely think, and I can't talk about the results yet because we haven't run like full statistics on them, but basically we didn't find huge differences amongst groups, right? So that is to say, at the very least, that taking a little bit of time away from training probably is not going to hurt your gains very much, at least in the long term, right? And then as far as how I go about programming them, regardless of my thesis, right? I think what you kind of alluded to there is a key indicator of needing a deload, which is people like yourself and myself who look training is their favorite part of the day, typically, and it's something that we look forward to. If you start to find yourself not wanting to go to the gym, you start to feel a little bit lethargic and just that general motivation to train decreases. That's usually a really good indicator to me that either I need a deload or one of my clients need a deload. Now that doesn't work across the board, obviously. I mean, there are people who will never say that they want time away from the gym and they'll just grind themselves into the dirt. And then you'll have people that just never want to work out anyway and have to force themselves to do it. So that wouldn't be a good indicator either. And there are other ways of kind of assessing if someone needs a deload or not. I like to personally do it in a much more auto-regulatory way rather than pre-planning out deloads. So performance decrements are obviously like the biggest one, but usually you probably don't want to wait to see performance decrements is usually how a lot of coaches go about it. I don't know how I stand on that, to be quite honest with you. There's just not a lot of literature on deloads and detraining in general. But what we do know is that you're probably not going to hurt yourself taking some time off from the gym. Even like complete detraining has not shown like huge detriments in the literature, though limited though it may be. But yeah, as far as planning deloads, it's definitely better to go auto-regulatory, I find, than it is to do pre-planned, because what's the point of taking a break after 4 weeks of training if you don't need one? And what's the point of pushing to 6 weeks of training if after week 3 you feel beat up? So I think if my biggest takeaway, and once again, I'm rambling here, but my biggest takeaway is just listen to your athletes and listen to your own body, and they'll kind of tell you if they need a deload or not.
Okay, yeah, I got you. No, your rambling is absolutely fantastic. I had Dr. Bill Campbell on a couple months back, and he sent me one of his research reviews where they reviewed a study where they did deloads, but they programmed it pretty goofy, I would say. I think they trained, I want to say they trained like 3 weeks and then took 2 weeks off and then trained 3 weeks and 2 weeks off. It was something real like nobody would actually do that. But by the end of the study, I think it was like 6 months. The people who just trained consistently and the people who took the deloads were pretty much at the same point by the end of the study, which was pretty fascinating. And to me, that kind of seemed like that's an area where people should really be like, hey, we need to do more research here to determine like, if we take a 1 week deload every 4 weeks, maybe the performance will be better at the end of 6 months. But, you know, obviously, as you said, it doesn't seem like there's a whole ton of literature there. So I'm not sure if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's a study by Ogasawa. Well, first of all, so sorry, I'm definitely going to butcher this name. I think it's a researcher out of Japan, but Ogasawa, yeah, did that study, and it was 6 months of like 6 weeks of training, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, or something like that. And yeah, it does not lend itself very well to ecological validity, which is basically to say like it's not a study that's representative of what people are doing in the real world. Right. Very few people are going hard for 6 weeks and then taking 3 weeks completely off of the gym and then cycling that through. So yeah, someone did look at that and say, hey, we need more, we want something with a little more ecological validity, hence my thesis. All I will say about those studies is that they do lend themselves once again to say that it's probably not a big deal if you take some time away from the gym. Like I think there's a lot of people like ourselves, Kyle, who find a lot of identity in going to the gym, and telling them that you can take a week off or 2 weeks off here and there is not going to be the end of the world. They're like, but what do I do if I'm not going to the gym 6 days? I don't know what to do for that week if I'm not going. But it's just not something to necessarily worry about. And I will note that in that Ogasawa study, there were no statistically significant differences between groups, but those in the group that did not take breaks, they did have slightly higher. I think they did have slightly higher gains in both hypertrophy and strength, though not statistically significant, which is a whole other can of worms that we can get into.
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, I kind of want to elucidate on that a little bit more. Do you know about the individuals? Because I remember reading the study, but I mean, this was probably like 5 or 6 months ago that I read this. And yeah, like I said, I think it was by the end of the study, they were at the same point, but you had said that they had a little bit better gains in the consistent training group. To me, that just kind of seems indicative of, hey, if you train consistently, and I'm guessing they weren't going extremely hard, because if I remember correctly, they were untrained individuals. And perhaps you could correct me on that. But by the end,
you're right. They were untrained for sure.
So yeah, it would to me kind of seem like, well, yeah, if you take 3 weeks off as an untrained individual, then that's just way too much time. And like you said, it's just not realistically the way that people do things.
Yeah, I don't know if that study is hindered because they were untrained. I'm not sure any. I can't tease out any mechanisms why using untrained subjects in that study would be worse than using trained subjects. But it doesn't really matter, trained or untrained, regardless of the population. It's the methods that they used that weren't very ecologically valid. Like even trained or untrained, most people aren't taking 3 weeks off of training at any given point in time. And if you are, that's hopefully not something you do every 6 weeks. Maybe it's something that you do every 6 months when you're going on a vacation, like some great long vacation. I don't know how many Americans are taking 3 week vacations, but yeah, I just don't think that's something that regardless of training status would lend itself well to the real world.
Mm-hmm. So one other thing that I've heard that's kind of interesting, and I'm sure you've probably heard this too if you listen to Iron Culture. I remember Eric Helms talking about the stretch boot for the calves, where they were seeing, I don't want to say it was significant, but it was like notable gains in people's calves when they would use a stretch device. And I guess the larger point for this, it was kind of going back to, I can't remember the person's name, but they were training birds with like weights or something like that. And they left the birds.
The avian hyperplasia study that everyone always talks about.
Yes. So it's basically trying to boil down the mechanism of stretch mediated hypertrophy. What do you know about that? And could you perhaps inform the audience on what that is and if you think that's a valid concept.
Yeah, so I don't know if I know a whole lot more than what you've already talked about. So stretch mediated hypertrophy, right? Where your muscle is theoretically growing completely irrespective of resistance training. So they had, I wish I had read up on the study a little bit more recently, but basically they had subjects. Yeah, they had them for, I think like 2 hours a day or something like that, stretch their calves at an 8 out of 10, like pain scale, which is to say like very painful. Like that, this is not something you're just like casually doing while watching TV. And they saw significant increases in muscle mass compared to unstretched legs. Right. And there is some reason to believe that this is a valid thing. However, personally, I think it might get washed out if you're also doing resistance training. Now, Eric Helms is doing a really cool case study on himself with this, and I think results from that will be pretty interesting, and it'll give us, though it is a case study, a little bit more insight into combining stretching with resistance training. But we also did a study at Lehman. It was led by Derek Van Avery, so shout out Derek, looking at stretching in between sets of resistance training on the calves, actually. So you would do a set of 8 to 12 on calf raises to failure, and then after the set, you would sink into that stretched position and just sit there for about 20 seconds, right? And we noticed very slight increases in, I believe, the soleus, but not either one of the medial or lateral gastroc. So do I think it's a valid way of growing muscle? It's unlikely. I don't think I wouldn't put a lot of chips into that basket of stretch mediated hypertrophy being like a really good thing, respective of resistance training. Now that kind of gets into its own conversation of these long muscle lengths in really stretched positions that we see Milo Wolf talking about, and I believe Mass just released something on this as well about training at long muscle lengths. That seems to be getting a lot more and more credence as things go on. I will say I did just see an interesting paper. I can't remember the author, but they were comparing incline curls, which is an exercise that puts the biceps in a very lengthened stretch position, to preacher curls, which takes the bicep and puts it into a very shortened position, right? And they actually showed significantly more increases distally on the biceps in the preacher curl group, which completely confounds this whole stretch mediated, or not stretch mediated, long muscle lengths conversation, except maybe it doesn't. And the reason being is because when you do an incline curl, the tension on the, sorry, I know this is kind of hard to say, the tension on the bicep when you're doing an incline curl at the most lengthened position is like zero. I mean, like the way that you're curling, like there's no weight on, there's no tension on the bicep here when you're doing at the start position. Whereas a preacher curl, when you're at the most lengthened position of the exercise, which isn't a very lengthened position anyway, the hardest part of the exercise is right there at the most lengthened position of the exercise. So there might be something there of not necessarily the muscle being stretched itself, but where is the exercise actually the hardest and where are you putting most of the effort into? That's just an interesting little tangent that I was having a conversation with my friend Daniel about the other day. Really went on a tangent there. Sorry, I don't even really know how we got there. I apologize.
Oh, no. It's awesome. And I think myself and the listeners are going to really enjoy kind of going down these deep dives. The reason why I kind of started getting interested in stretch mediated hypertrophy was because I remember Mike Israetel mentioning just like real quickly that, oh yeah, well, the most stimulative is when you're at like the most stretched, right? So like if you're doing a set of like incline bench press, right? Then, you know, that very, very low part where the bar's on your chest, that's when you're going to, you know, trigger the most amount of growth because it's the most difficult part of the exercise. And what that encouraged me to do, and I've definitely seen notable gains in my chest, but I mean, I also recently started benching again after not doing it for a long time. But it seems like my chest has responded really, really well to that. And I typically use like the cambered, the buffalo bar on the incline press. And yeah, it's a hell of a stretch at the very bottom of the rep. So I'm not sure if you have any kind of more thoughts on that.
No, it's like I couldn't agree more with Dr. Mike in that instance. And I'm sure, yeah, like doing a incline press or any pressing movement where you're really like emphasizing that stretch, or really you can set up exercises to be more difficult in a stretched position versus in a shortened position. And Yeah, like I would, if I were a betting man, I'd probably put my chips towards that, towards things the most stretched portion of the exercise typically being the most hypertrophic. I think I would agree with him there, which is why I think we're seeing so much data kind of lending itself to this lengthened partials thing that Milo Wolf is such a big fan of. So yeah, I think that if you can find an exercise that is comfortable for you, where you can accentuate that the difficulty of the exercise in the stretched position, it's probably a good idea to do. Now, that's not to say that we should completely ignore other portions of the exercise. Right. I'm not fully on board with doing only lengthened partials, obviously, though I do think it's a good idea. So yeah, I think that there are probably some reasons to believe that maybe training the shortened position even is still a really good idea, obviously.
Okay. So yeah, one other thing that you were just talking about there, and I have Milo coming on here in a couple of weeks. I got him scheduled, and I'm excited to talk to him because Mike is a big proponent of full range of motion, but as you were kind of alluding to there, he's put out a lot of research recently that's suggesting that lengthened partials may actually be very, very beneficial. So I'm not sure what kind of research you've kind of seen out of that, or if you've read any of his studies, because like I said, I've always been of the mind of you should always do full range of motion, so that way not only do you keep your joints healthy, but that's, from what I initially understood, the most beneficial way to train, because you're exposing yourself to, once again, that lengthened position.
Yeah, so I mean, for a long time, that was the prevailing thought, because that was the best data that we had on it, was saying that, yeah, full range of motion is probably a good idea. But that might be because we were just thinking about partial range of motion a little bit incorrectly, right? Mm-hmm. I will pull you back on saying that it's better for joints and stuff. I don't know where this idea comes from. I understand that you have to use less weight when you use full range of motion. And definitely, yeah, probably it's gun to my head. It probably is safer to use a full range of motion, which forces you to use less weight. But I just don't think that we can confidently make that claim as of right now.
Okay.
Anyway, moving towards that. Yeah, I think that because of this data that's coming out, looking at maybe partials the right way, which is to say doing them in a lengthened position rather than a shortened position, we are kind of seeing that, okay, maybe this whole full range of motion thing that this evidence-based community has been preaching for so long might be a little bit misguided. And it might actually be better to use a partial range of motion, which is going to be a fun, if it does end up coming to be true that, yes, full lengthened partials are definitely better in almost all contexts than full range of motion. It's going to be a fun conversation watching all the bodybuilders be like, see, look, we were right all around. Look, we were right all along.
Yeah.
And you gym nerds, you science nerds have taken long to catch up to us, essentially. So I'm not willing to, like I said, I'm not willing to say that full range of motion is something that we should completely ditch. We should stop doing it. But it does seem like things are kind of moving in that direction. We'll see, though.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's really interesting because it seems like that's almost consensus at this point. So, well, kind of when it comes to programming that, I haven't even really attempted to do this. So, for length and partials, let's say a squat, would that kind of be like going the whole way to the bottom and maybe coming up like a half, maybe 3/4 of the way and going back down? Would that be kind of like doing a length and partial, would you say, or how would you kind of go about programming this for someone?
No, I mean, bada bing, bada boom. You just kind of nailed it right there.
Okay.
Like you would start the squat. Obviously, you start the squat standing, but you go all the way down, really accentuate the knee forward movement, assuming you're squatting for quads. Mm-hmm. And you come up, not all the way, probably halfway up to like parallel or something like that, depending on how low you're squatting. And that would be an example of a length and partial exercise. Sorry, 1 second.
No, that's okay.
I think a really good example of this is you can see Steve Hall doing this a lot on his Instagram, where he does bent over rows, where he rows to his knee and then goes all the way back down to the ground and rows to his knee, rather than pulling all the way up to his stomach or his chest or what have you. I think that those are another really good way of visualizing what length and partials look like. I don't want people to get it twisted that length and partials, because a big caveat to length and partials is it's hard to standardize, which I think I don't think that's a great argument personally. So for instance, like lat pull downs, it's really easy to know when we're done, right? We pull down until the bar touches our chest, what have you. But it's just as easy to pull down until the bar is right at your eye line or right to your forehead, for instance. So I think that's another example of how you could program length and partials. Full disclosure, just like you, Kyle, I've actually not toyed around with these yet. I do a lot of exercise that accentuate the length and position anyway. I try to do length and leg extensions. I do a lot of RDLs for my hamstrings, and I do a lot of flies that try and accentuate the stretch on my chest. But I'm cutting right now, so I'm not trying to manipulate a whole bunch of variables while doing it. But I will say that as soon as I'm done with this cut, I'm going to start a new mesocycle, and I'm going to program some length and partials to give it a shot for myself to see how I like it. It's definitely something I want to practice on myself before having any of my clients do it, just because I like to experiment on myself before experimenting with my clients.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel you. I've kind of done it when it comes to like supplementation. You know, when turkesterone and beta-actosterone were kind of going around huge, I'm like, all right, well, you know what, I'll do it if I can find it for cheap enough, I'll try it. But you know, surely enough, I didn't really see any results.
Yeah.
So when it comes to supplementation, for me, I usually just say like beta alanine and creatine. You know, obviously, I don't really consider protein powder a supplement. I think that's more of a food, but you know, some people consider it a supplement. And then maybe like I also do like fish oil, CLA, and like a multivitamin. That's pretty much all I do. Is there anything that you would recommend supplement wise?
So yeah, I mean, yeah, I have basically the same opinions as you. The only supplement that I take is creatine, and now we're having some more and more data coming out that maybe that's not even worth taking. It's a cool little plug for a creatine study that just dropped, actually. So shout out to you, Ryan Burke, for leading that one. So we have some evidence to say that maybe it's not as good for hypertrophy as we once thought, right? But I still take it. It's super cheap, and it's hedging my bets that it'll improve my body composition, regardless of if that's directly from hypertrophy or not. Fish oils, you're not going to hurt yourself taking fish oils. A multivitamin's probably a safe bet. To be quite honest, and yeah, like whey protein, it's more of a real meal replacement, but it's sure as hell a great thing to have on hand. If you call it a supplement, yeah, you should be taking whey protein just because it's like the nicest thing to have on hand if you're, you know, you don't want to walk to the store for a chicken breast or what have you. I will say my favorite supplement that we haven't talked about is caffeine. I think personally, caffeine is an amazing supplement. It's better than a supplement. It's quite literally a drug, and I love it. And I think it's amazing for weight loss. I think it's amazing for gym performance. I think it's awesome. And then the last supplement that I think I'll plug, because I get money from all of these supplement companies, is probably vitamin D. I think that there is a good reason to believe that supplementing vitamin D, especially in winter months, is probably a good idea. It's probably just not something that's going to hurt you. And again, vitamin D is pretty cheap. You can get like 1 billion tablets from Costco for like $10. So those are the ones that I would typically recommend. They're cheap. They're easy. They're no negative health effects associated with eating them taking them. So yeah, I would say vitamin D, caffeine, creatine, and like we said, if we call whey protein a supplement, then whey protein as well.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So what's kind of that new research coming out against creatine? And then I didn't hear you include beta alanine, so I'm curious your thoughts on beta alanine, because from what I understand, that's supposed to help you buffer lactic acid towards like the end of your set. So like, you know, if you're doing the 45 to 60 second sets, then in theory, that's supposed to give you better gains. So I'm curious if maybe there's some data that you've seen that may disagree with that, or if you just don't think it's useful.
It's not. The creatine one, I'll start there. We recently did a meta-analysis here looking, which was actually surprising to us that there hadn't been a meta-analysis done on creatine for hypertrophy specifically. So we ran that, and we basically found like very modest effects. Or two trivial effects. We did a sub-analysis and found that there may be a slight benefit for younger individuals doing it rather than older individuals, but I'm just not confident saying that because I believe there was like 2 studies on younger individuals and the rest were on older individuals that we analyzed in that meta-analysis. I could be wrong, so I apologize if I'm misspeaking here, but I'm not putting all my chips into 2 studies saying that it had a modest effect. That being said, like I said, it's cheap. It's not hurting you to take it. It's totally fine. Now, beta alanine, I'm not super familiar with research on beta alanine. I just have heard people much smarter than myself talk about it. And they seem to suggest that, yeah, it probably isn't worth, taking beta alanine specifically for like strength and hypertrophy related goals. But same with creatine, like there's probably not a lot of negatives to taking it. It's not a very expensive supplement. So if it's something that you enjoy, and beta alanine is the one that gives you the tingles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people love that. So like if you're someone who really enjoys having your skin feel like there's bugs crawling under it while you're training, then be my guest. Take beta alanine all you like. I certainly like the edge that caffeine gives me when I'm training. Yeah. So I'm assuming it's kind of a similar placebo to beta alanine as well. So it's not something that I would ever be like, oh my God, what are you doing? Don't take that. But it's something that I would say, probably, if you're strapped for cash, it's probably not something I would be throwing money towards.
All right, guys. I'm absolutely thrilled with the show's new sponsor. I am now sponsored and have an affiliate through LMNT electrolytes. I've used these electrolytes for years. Back when I used to do a lot of fasting, in fact, I used to drink sometimes I want to say up to 7 a day, 7 little packets. So the packets are full of all the electrolytes that you need to perform and hydrate yourself properly. You need sodium for pretty much every single function in your body, despite what a lot of people may tell you. Sodium doesn't actually cause a lot of the issues that people kind of would have you believe. So just real quick to give you a little bit of facts. You don't need sugar to hydrate. Electrolytes and water don't require glucose to pass through the gut. The average American consumes over 60 pounds of sugar a year. And when it comes to athletic performance, you can actually lose up to 7 grams per day in hot climate. So make sure you click on the affiliate link below to get all your hydration needs. And like I said, I'm super stoked to have these guys teamed up with the podcast, and just make sure you get your electrolytes through Element. All right, guys, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, that's completely fair. Yeah, I do take a crap load of caffeine. I have so many pre-workouts, and then obviously my whole little Keurig thing downstairs, and I have my coffee every single morning. What are your thoughts on like sodium pre-workout? Because I know a lot of like the low carb people promote this, and I used to do carnivore and I found that it really helped then. Now that I have a more of a flexible dieting advocate, I don't find it quite as useful. So I'm not sure if you're kind of aware of anything in that regard.
So sodium, I've seen like some people on Instagram talking about like taking a tablespoon of table salt before your workout to increase pumps and stuff. And I mean, I think that most people, especially in America, are probably getting plenty of sodium in their everyday, like diet. Like whatever you're eating, you're probably getting enough sodium. You're probably salting your food if you're cooking at home even. So like, it's not something that I would really ever tell people to do. It's, once again, probably not going to hurt you to take salt, like a decent amount of salt, as long as you're not eating, so much salt that you're like hurting yourself. And you maybe monitor your blood pressure if you're someone that is eating like a tablespoon of salt before every single workout. But it's not something that I think is gonna make a huge difference. Some people say that it leads to like way better pumps for them, and they may just be like under eating sodium throughout the day. So like, for instance, if you're on a carnivore diet and you're not eating a lot of processed foods with typically high amounts of sodium, yeah, it's probably gonna feel good to eat sodium, because you're just getting back to like what is your baseline for what you should be consuming for sodium throughout the day anyway. But generally speaking, it's not something that I recommend to people.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair enough then. So when it comes to training for you and your clients, how do you kind of program for them? Like, let's say somebody comes to you that has never trained before. Do you start them off on kind of like a 3-day full body, 2-day full body, or what does that kind of look like? And how do you kind of walk them through that?
Yeah, so I typically start. I'm maybe a little bit even more conservative than your average individual when it comes to starting novices out on training. But it depends on their goals. So like, how do I train for people? Is like, that's a whole podcast episode in itself. Is how we go about structuring programming for different individuals. But let's say I have someone coming to me who's never lifted before, and let's say that it's an online interaction, right? I would probably have them. Usually, my question is, how many days do you want to work out? And then I give a caveat to that, which is, what is the number of days that on your worst week, that you can make it to the gym? that way, just because I think it's easier to have a very set, strict program that is manageable than having a loosey-goosey, much more difficult program to like kind of adapt as we go along. And it's different client to client, obviously. So like I know Bill Campbell, for instance, has like a 3-day program that he runs and a 5-day program that he runs depending on the week, right? That's a little bit more difficult for a new lifter. So I usually say like 2 to 3 days, mostly machine-based stuff. If their goal is just general health and like even hypertrophy, unless they're like really interested in strength gains, then we'll throw some barbells in there as well for some big 3 lifts. But generally it's machines-based stuff, and that's solely so that those are much easier to learn, I find, for individuals, and they're just easier for me to like correct techniques through videos and stuff, whether it's like a deadlift, a squat, bench press is a little bit more difficult if I'm not there in person to give you cues while you're exercising and stuff. And then just keeping volumes and intensities relatively low to make sure that the client has the technique down. And then as that client progresses in understanding what it means to be consistent in the gym, then we'll start throwing some bells and whistles in there to make it like a much more comprehensive program. So I think I rambled there too, but basically start low, maybe even lower than most people generally do, and then start building up to like a more comprehensive training program.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, it kind of seems like most beginners start off around like a 3-day program where, like you said, kind of like with a lot of machines, and then kind of build their way up. And when it comes to more like trained people, it seems like recently push-pull legs really blew up. And I ran that for a little bit. That was kind of like my first diving into training muscles more than once a week, and I really, really liked it. But then, you're kind of living in the gym. It's like, hey, you're here 6 days a week and just really getting after it. And if you're deadlifting and including, compound lifts twice a week, that can really take a toll on you. And then now I've kind of rolled back to like 4 days a week, just doing like a full body pull, full body push, 4 days a week. And I'm thinking I may go to like a 3-day a week again, full body, just to kind of, I don't want to say get a little bit of a break, but just because I kind of changing it up every here and there. So what does your training look like now?
So yeah, I'm kind of the opposite of you actually, in that I would rather be in so like ideally, truthfully, like this isn't just me playing devil's advocate. Ideally, if I had my druthers and I could do whatever I wanted, I would train 6 days a week, 2-a-days, 12 times a week in the gym. And the reason, well, one, I just love training, but also it's not because I'm just this hardcore dude who trains harder than you do, Kyle. It's because I would rather be in the gym for a shorter period of time and get like really nice quality work in than be in there for like 2 to 3 hours. Because if you're training 2 to 3 days a week, like you got to be in the gym like a decent amount of time. Like I'm not saying you have to train for 4 hours, but like you have to be in there. If you want to make decent progress, you have to spend a bit of time in the gym. It's just how it goes, right? And so if you do that spread over 3 days, you're going to have to be in the gym for over an hour and a half, probably. If you do it spread over 6 days, you just don't have to be in the gym for much more than an hour, almost ever, really. So I definitely prefer 6 days, even when, so like, for instance, like this semester, right? From February to literally yesterday, I was running my thesis and I was in the gym Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from basically like 9 to 4 p.m. training subjects. I'm not doing a heavy squat workout after training people all day long. It's just I'm not going to have good productive training. I'm beat up. I'm tired, both emotionally, psychologically, and physically. I'm just tired. I'm beat, right? But I still want to train 6 days a week just because I don't want to on Tuesdays and Thursdays be in the gym for, 4 to 6 hours, whatever have you, right? So what I did for the semester was I had one rest day like I normally do, and I took it on Wednesdays because that was just our heaviest research day. And I would do, on days that we were training people, I would just hit shoulders and calves. Look, no one's day is so hard that they can't go home and do a set of lateral raises instead of calf raises, right? Like there's just exercises that take very little like emotional bandwidth to complete. And then I would save those like harder, bigger muscle focused days like back, chest, quads, hams, whatever you may be. I would leave those for days in which I wasn't conducting research. So I would do basically like 4 days of like actual training where I was hitting like big heavy compounds and doing like actual fun training. And then I would have 2 days a week where I was basically just doing shoulders and calves, which is just something to keep me in the gym without actually taxing me. Now that I'm done with research, I fortunately can go back to training the way I want to, which is, like I said, 6 days a week of like all actual workouts rather than 4 real workouts and then 2 little supplementary days.
Mhm.
And that'll probably look something like just it doesn't fall under like a nice, clean split, like push pull legs or upper lower or anything like that. But I think it's closest to like a modified full body, where like on Monday I'll maybe doing like legs and maybe some shoulders as well. And then I'll have my upper day where it's a little bit more chest focused with a little bit of back, and then, just kind of like cycling through the week that way.
Okay. Yeah. So one other thing I was curious about, in your time researching, has there been anything that really changed the way that you trained or that you changed your mind on?
So I've been gearing my training towards like this research evidence-based thing for the last, 6 years now, I guess. Which is to say that like my mind is constantly changing on things, obviously. Like, for instance, we just talked about the like wrinkles in this whole like lengthened partials like evidence, right? So my mind is changing on that, even though it was just changed on that recently anyway. So like things are constantly changing because it's such an infant field where like new information is constantly coming out. But I will say that the most prevailing thing that I just constantly keep learning and constantly keep having to tell myself is that more is not always better. And I know that sounds silly to say, especially since we're talking to a mostly evidence-based crowd who knows that more is not always better. But like really letting that sink in and understanding that it's actually true, because I mean, dude, we're bros. We're lifters. Like we're in that community where generally people are screaming, go harder, do more, whatever have you. Right. And trying to like constantly remind yourself that, hey, look, as fun as it is to go balls to the wall, it actually might not be as optimal as we think. So I think constantly reminding myself of that fact is probably the most prevailing and consistent thing that research has showed me, is that there is a limit to which your body can recover from, and pushing it past that is not making you any cooler or harder. It's just actually hurting your progress more than anything else. So train within your body's recoverable capacities, I think, is the big takeaway that I've found over the last couple of years.
Yeah. The stimulus to fatigue ratio is very, very important. And I've definitely found that that's, a huge thing for me. If I'm feeling pretty beat up, I know you were talking about your hamstrings earlier, but I find that if I do a set of RDLs pretty freaking hard, then I'm usually pretty torched for quite a few days. And the next pull workout isn't all that good when I do something like that. So one more thing I wanted to touch on with you, and then we could probably wrap it here in a few, is nutrition stuff. So I said earlier, I was carnivore, and now I do more of a flexible dieting approach. It seems like most of the evidence kind of just points to like, hey, as long as you're hitting sufficient protein, the rest of it doesn't matter. Don't go crazy, like putting a whole stick of butter in your coffee, and try to get as much fiber as possible. And that seems to be kind of like the recommendations for nutrition in general. So like for me personally, I eat a little bit higher fat, but still get anywhere from like 40 to 80 grams of fiber a day, and usually about 180 grams of protein. And then, like I said, carbs and fats may fall where they may. So I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, so I think full disclosure for anyone watching, I did get some questions before we started this, and one of them was, what does your diet look like? And as a master student completing his thesis, you don't want to know what my diet looks like for an example of how people should be eating. I was drinking like 4 double shot espresso, like Starbucks mocha things a day. And then like, I was like, oh shit, it's 10 p.m. and I have to hit my protein. So let's chug 3 Fairlife protein bottles with 44 grams of protein each.
Oh, God.
Don't live like that. Don't eat like that. This is not a recommendation. But yeah, I mean, look, you kind of got it. You kind of hit the nail on the head there, which is like, there's pretty loose rules here as far as nutrition is concerned, which is really, that's really nice for a lot of people, is that like, there are some, fundamental things that you should do. Hit your protein, eat fruits and vegetables. Yes, obviously, like fiber is there to consider as well. Maybe don't eat all of your protein in one meal, and maybe, make sure your micronutrients are in check, essentially. So cover that with eating fruits and vegetables, right? And then, like the 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein. Maybe you can get away with even less. And then just making sure your calories aren't out of whack, either too high or too low if you're trying to lose or gain weight. there's just very set principles. Like there's just like it's just not that nuanced. I mean, there are ways to get way more nuanced about that. That's not me saying that nutrition is not nuanced. Eric Drexler, please don't come after me for that. But I think you kind of got it, man. Like, yeah, hit your protein, make sure that you're eating plenty of fiber through fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and most is probably going to fall. Like I personally track my protein and calories when I'm dieting. And when I'm not dieting, like when I'm not cutting, I kind of just, I make sure I'm getting enough protein and I make sure that I'm not gaining weight too quickly, make sure to have some fruits and veggies here. And then when things start to get a little bit more serious, so like I start my cuts usually around 205 pounds, 210 pounds, and usually end up around like 175 to 180, 170 on the lower end. And when I start getting to like 175, 180, I kind of have to start being a little bit more serious about things where I'll start tracking, like making sure that my fats and my carbs aren't too out of whack. Because I find that normally I can just let them fall where they may be. But once I start getting lean enough, I have to start making sure that I'm getting enough fat so that I feel, like I feel good and I have like optimal hormone production there. And then I also have to make sure that I'm getting enough carbs so I don't feel super depleted for training. Mm-hmm. I think, but like if you follow the basic principles, unless you're in pretty extreme circumstances, it's just not a magical, there's nothing there. You're not going to turn over some rock that's going to like substantially improve your results in the gym unless that rock is eating like protein or getting vegetables and fruit in and shit like that.
Yeah. I've gone to bat with the seed oil people quite a bit just because it seems to be the in thing right now that seed oils are going to kill you. And it's like, come on, guys. Like, this is so ridiculous. That little teaspoon of seed oil that you get every single day is not killing you. And from what I understand of the literature, may actually have a cardioprotective effect when you do the studies and you compare different fats versus saturated fat, which was hard for me to come to as a guy who was formerly carnivore, to see all the research that says, hey, that's probably not good for you.
Yeah, people are really running away with the whole, I think people in the carnivore community are typically running away with this whole like seed oils thing, and also the defense chemicals of fruits and vegetables that are also really bad for you. Don't listen to those people. I mean, if you're watching this podcast and you're listening to people like Bill Campbell and all the other wonderful guests you've had on your podcast, you probably already know this stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, maybe we don't listen to the carnivore crowd. Let's turn that noise down a little bit. I was hope that the whole Liver King exposure thing would have led to like a kind of a decline in the carnivore world, but I don't know if that seems to be the case or not.
Yeah, it's really, really appealing because I think it sells to people's kind of instincts that, this one trick. And every single time I see that, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to murder somebody. I swear to God. And I've done a little bit of research on it, but like the eating disorder stuff, just like making people crazy about what they're eating. It's like, that's going to cause people way more damage than anything that you're telling them not to eat. And they eat it might actually cause them, like artificial sweeteners. You're going to be fine. Like all this stuff. Just quit worrying about that. The basic recommendations are fine that we kind of laid out here. It's just, I feel so bad because people like come to me all the time and they're like scared to eat anything except for stuff with high fat, and they want to just chug butter. I'm like, relax, carbs aren't going to kill you guys. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, I want to chug butter too. Don't get me wrong, but it's just. It's not something that it's not something I recommend to people by any means, especially not for like health purposes, obviously. Who knows, man? You get used to it, by the way. Like, I'm saying this to you, who's older than me, obviously, sorry, but like, it's going to happen. And like in 5 years, it's not going to be seed oils. It'll be that actually, protein is bad. We didn't know protein was bad. Now this new like low protein fad diet is out. That's like way better for losing weight. So who knows? Yeah, I'm getting used to the fad diet thing. It's just they're so cyclical, and it's exhausting. But then hopefully it ends soon. Which with some of these really, really promising obesity ending drugs that are potentially coming out.
Yeah, well, I know Ozempic was a pretty big one, but from what I understand, that just slows the gastric emptying, so it really crushes people's appetite. But the problem there is once you go off of it, if you don't understand the mechanisms or change your behavior, then unfortunately you may gain a lot of that weight back.
Yeah, for sure. And like, there's no question about that, obviously. But hopefully I just think that like new advances are happening constantly that are going to make things. Hopefully, I think Israel talks a lot about how the next 10 years are going to be really cool. Mm-hmm. I think he's right. I think the next 10 years are going to be really cool. And who knows, maybe trainers like us are going to be out of a job, but it'll definitely be worth it for the betterment of the human world that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully. All right. Yeah, we've been going for about an hour now, Max. I've really enjoyed this chat, so we'll definitely have to do it again sometime. Where can everybody find you, your research and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I mean, you guys can. I'm sure we'll link it in the show notes on wherever it is that we post this. But you can follow me on Instagram. You just type in Max Coleman, it'll come up. But my handle is Sharkbait which is a Finding Nemo joke for anyone out there that would understand. But yeah, I'm on Instagram. I'm on ResearchGate. I don't have a Twitter, which I probably should get on because a lot of people are more serious on Twitter. But definitely look me up and throw me a follow. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, awesome stuff, man. Well, like I said, I really enjoyed this chat. Very informative, and I found that your research was very digestible and informative for me as well. So I'll like I said, I'll link all your stuff in the show notes below, and if you've got anything else, we'll close her out.
I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Max. Well, until next time, everybody, thanks for listening and take care.